Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Crypto Hipster Podcast. This is your host, Jamil Hassan, the Crypto Hipster, where I interview founders, entrepreneurs, executives, thought leaders, amazing people all around the world. And today I have an amazing guest coming to me from Dubai. And the weather there's a little hotter than it is right here in Connecticut, where I am. He is the CEO and founder of Irys. His name is Josh Benaron. Josh, welcome to the show.
I appreciate having me.
Thank you for joining me. And I'll kick things off, and hopefully I pronounced your last name properly. I usually ask before time, but I ask you this: what is your background, and is it a logical background for what you're doing now?
Somewhat. So my background is pretty minimal. So I started Irys now 3.5 years ago, but before that, I was actually just studying computer science at the time in the UK. And so I guess that does support with doing stuff in the world of crypto. But in terms of what I was doing outside of just my degree, which I found quite boring at the time, was mostly things around databases, and specifically SQL databases. To try and draw some kind of similarities between the two, the kind of where we are now, what we're doing now, Irys, which is in the data chain space, and what I was doing then, which is around kind of database stuff in the open source world. There are some kind of storage components to databases. So database is a combination of storage and compute, really. And it's about optimizing performance between the two. So you start to kind of realize that databases are bottlenecked by things like storage. So it a little bit ties into what we're doing today in the data chain space. And yeah.
Interesting. I had a SQL background too when I built databases, so I'm interested personally to know how your transition was to go from creating databases in SQL to crypto.
Yeah, it was a very I want to say it kind of helped, but it doesn't. When you do computer science, it teaches you how to learn in some way, but it doesn't kind of teach you, it doesn't map the things straight to a blockchain world. So I think as with anyone, I got into crypto about in early 2020, and as with anyone who gets into crypto, that your initial reaction is like, whoa, this doesn't make any sense, especially if you don't come from a distributed systems background, because everything is so different. It's not like it's just a centralized database that it's like, okay, you have 100 different people on the network, and somehow they will have some kind of synchronized database. How on earth does this work? So it definitely it's the same with everyone. It wasn't the smoothest entry, but I think once you spend a few months kind of studying this stuff and you adopt the correct mental models and frameworks, then it all becomes very easy. I mean, after now being in the space for over 4 years, I can confidently say that I think I understand it, but definitely back then it was a little bit more of a shock.
Yeah, definitely a shock. I came in 2017. It was definitely a shock. So, Irys, I want to find out what Irys is all about and what does it mean to be the first programmable data chain.
Yeah, so I guess to give some quick background on Irys. So we actually started back in early 2021, April time 2021, and we actually entered into the Arweave ecosystem specifically. So Irys was initially a L2 or a scaling solution for Arweave. So Arweave is the permanent storage chain. The idea is that you pay once and your data is stored forever. If you come back in 100 years time, then you'll still be able to retrieve your data. It's kind of the core idea. And Irys was essentially a way to scale that. So you can, instead of doing only a few writes per second, you can actually do 10,000 writes per second or uploads per second. Anyway, so we launched that in kind of later 2021, and then ended up dropping out of university to obviously focus on Irys. And we took our way from doing about 10,000 transactions a day to doing about 15 million a day. We onboarded kind of 300 plus projects. And then about kind of what we announced, we've been working on it obviously for a while, but we now announced kind of Irys as the first programmable data chain 4 weeks ago from recording, or 5 weeks ago actually. I'm losing track of time. Time moves too fast in crypto. So that's kind of the context of how we got here, and the idea behind the reason I got into the data chain space, because I remember back in late 2020 I discovered Arweave, Filecoin, Storage, Sia, even Chia back then, which is not spoken about much anymore. The, I kind of built conviction that one, whichever story, which kind of ties to the messaging, whichever kind of data chain one would become this kind of canonical record of history, source of truth. That was always the messaging that Arweave, Filecoin kind of pumped out, whether it being kind of this store of kind of humanity's most valuable information. And I still believe in that end goal. But over time, I built conviction on this more kind of utilitarian vision, which is that crypto has been very indexed on these financial rails, whether it's Bitcoin to Ethereum to Solana. But there's been very little innovation on, basically what the rest of the web is run on, which is data and infrastructure rails. And the question was for me was always, okay, how do we bring those kind of traditional kind of data, kind of more centric web services on chain? And initially kind of started in the world of Arweave and now launching around L1. And so when I talk about kind of the vision for Irys, it's about how do we actually bring those web services on chain. And I think about like a subjective like KPI almost is if we can incrementally bring more web services on chain over time, then we will essentially be winning in years to come. So that's kind of the very high level, but at a more kind of concrete level, Irys is a programmable data chain. So data chain means that it's a chain optimized for storage, and we can dive into what that means. But the idea is that how can you kind of store a yottabyte, which is like many petabytes worth or exabytes worth of storage on chain, worth of data on chain, sorry. And then also, how do you have a closely coupled execution layer with that enables you to do computation on the data as well? Because data by itself is useless, but when you add kind of useful computation with it, now it becomes more. Data is not oil by itself; it's it's more like sand. When you add computation, it becomes more like oil. So that's kind of the core idea. And in terms of our focus on where we see this being applied in the real world, the way I kind of talk about this is that we want to essentially build a unified layer that is optimized for applications that rely on data to operate and scale. So if you think about deeper networks, a lot of deeper networks are essentially aggregating a bunch of data, defining monetary policy based off of that. A lot of them are doing computation on that data. And the question is, how can we kind of bring those kind of stacks fully on chain? And AI is another interesting use case because it's very data heavy as well, data computation heavy. And there's some there are some interesting consumer angles. But anyway, that's a very long answer, but it gives you at least a high level perspective on what we're cooking.
It's interesting because a lot, you look at Bitcoin that created the Lightning Network, and I look at Ethereum that created all these L2s. They're looking to take information and data off chain to make it faster. You're bringing it on chain, so I'm really interested to see how you bringing it on chain makes it more robust and faster and more efficient. It looks like the opposite direction. Why so?
It's a good question. So there are kind of a lot of kind of dimensions to that. One is a pure cost perspective. So if you want to extrapolate data chains as a form of deeper network, where you have the supply side as basically a bunch of storage providers or people with a bunch of hard drives, hard drive capacity, and then the demand side is people wanting to store data in some way. Then the cool thing about all deeper networks, I'll generalize it, is that what they do is they enable huge amounts of supply at a mega low cost due to token incentives, meaning that the cost of the actual service commodity they're providing is much lower. So that's definitely one component, and we can tie it. I can kind of tie that into how that will look in the future. But I think there are also kind of very traditional qualities that that all blockchains have here. So the data that's stored is censorship resistant, it's decentralized, it can be globally replicated, and the idea over time is how can you actually kind of allow different levels of replication, allow it within specific locations as well for compliance reasons as well, and it's obviously immutable by default, right? So because it's based on typical kind of blockchains and cryptography. So those are kind of the key properties. It should be cheaper. It should be immutable and decentralized slash censorship resistant. And in terms of the goal here is that as you bring the efficiency and speed of these things up, and it's already pretty fast, and we can go into that, then the benefit of using centralized providers will essentially tend to zero. And all of the everyone will essentially kind of skew towards using these decentralized networks because it's just way cheaper to use and it's the same performance.
Yeah, cost is part of it, but part of optimization. So, what about how you optimize data storage and execution? I guess one of the elements is cost, and there's other elements. Please, can you elaborate?
Yeah, so the idea is how can we enable any amount of data to be stored on chain? That's kind of one way to make it more efficient. And then two, for the data that's actually stored on chain, how can we use very efficient methods to verify that data? So if you look at existing data chains that have existed up to this point, so there's something like Filecoin, which is like a good mental model is that's like a temporary like data chain where it enables you to store data for a temporary time period. And then Arweave, which is permanent data chain. So if you look at something like Filecoin, they use a bunch of very complex cryptography, mostly ZK, zero knowledge cryptography, which makes everything exceedingly slow. Which means that uploading is slow, retrieving is slow. Like even just the base commodity that they're providing is fundamentally very, 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 very slow. So one of the goals we had, and something that we learned from running kind of Irys previously as the scaling solution for Arweave, is that people care about performance. Sounds very profound, but it was just an obvious thing where people would just use us because we're the most performant. And it's the way to kind of enable that in the world of Irys is actually it's a kind of a multidimensional thing again. So that one of the cool features is that we actually use a dual ledger approach, which enables essentially data to be quickly seeded to the network or quickly kind of uploaded to the network, and then eventually kind of replicated across the world. So that's number one. And then two, we purposely actually don't use any of the zero knowledge approaches because there's absolutely no benefit to it. In fact, there are only drawbacks. The cost of zero knowledge doing on kind of exabytes of data is many, many, many millions of dollars a year worth of GPU compute. So when you're looking at something like Filecoin, you might think, okay, well, most of the cost goes into storing data. Well, no, actually, when you look at the inflation emissions versus the fiat liabilities, or basically how much miners are spending to operate, most of it goes towards ZK related operations, so GPU based compute, which is just in my mind kind of stupid because your network is meant to provide kind of a cheap way to do storage, etc. If the most complex part if the most expensive part is doing all this computation that users don't even care about because they don't really care that they use ZK or something else, then you're basically printing a bunch of money and giving it to people, and you're just burning money. So if you look at it from an economy perspective, like they're printing $100 million a year, let's say, making numbers up. Why are they giving away $50 million or more to do this CK process that has no benefit, and it just deflates the token and devalues the entire ecosystem? So there's kind of like a multi-dimensional interconnected thing to look at.
It's interesting because I've had a number of podcasts where people have thought that ZK is the next $1 trillion opportunity. And you're saying ZK is stupid. So I want
to no. So I think ZK. Damn, people on Twitter are going to kill me. But no, I think ZK is absolutely massive, and I think it's getting exponentially better. I think it's not great when you're dealing with exabytes of data. So ZK is being used for ZK EVMs, but the amount of data we're talking is tiny. The amount of computation we're talking is tiny. But you're equally not running ZK. You're not doing ZK AI training right now. But ZK is way too expensive. There are definitely initiatives to do this. And again, I don't want anyone kind of getting too triggered. I believe in ZK, but ZK, in my view, is at least 5 to 10 years away for using at scale for something like exabytes of storage. It's just a different problem where ZK, I think, is less of a good fit.
Got it. So what you're building a robust data infrastructure, and what is the key to that? You said the word scalability, and also I'm assuming security is also important. So how do you build it while you maintain both scalability and security?
Yeah, so scalability is mostly an architecture thing when it comes to storage and data chains. So when you're talking about enabling scalability, you're doing that through horizontal scaling, which is basically saying if there are more miners on the network or more people providing capacity, then the net kind of throughput of the network should go up, which is a property that you can have with data chains. It's not true for other execution chains like Solana, for example. but it is true for execution chains because you can scale them horizontally. Where security is a very different problem. Well, it's a slightly different problem where I kind of break down security as a combination of immutability, which is the default property, which uses whether it's Merkle trees or just traditional kind of cryptography techniques, and then plus the economic components, right? So basically allocating tokens to people or miners on the network that are doing the useful work. So Irys uses a proof of work stake hybrid algorithm actually, and it's actually a useful proof of work. So when you're looking at something like Bitcoin, you're dealing with a proof of work algorithm, which I would say is not useful. The compute is not going towards any kind of real world kind of value creation, so to speak, token valuation aside. Whereas something like Irys, the proof of work algorithm is actually sampling the actual hard drives and storage, which is a core function of the network. So it's actually a useful proof of work algorithm. And then we have staking as because the key reason why staking is very important for data chains, and some of them don't have staking, is if some provider on the network or miner on the network drops your data, well, they need to be punished for that, and they should be slashed for that. So the idea is you have to have this collateral on the network, and miners will essentially lose this money if they stop storing the data. So that's a very crucial point for data chains.
I would punish them too for wrong data, but
that's... so there are definitely rules in the network where if you propagate anything that is cryptographically incorrect, so to speak, that, well, in some edge cases you will also get slashed. So there are a bunch of different scenarios, like random edge cases where you get slashed as well. But the cool thing is that no one does that because cryptography is math for the Americans, and no one can refute that.
Got it. So I have to refute something that you said about Bitcoin. I'm not a maximalist by any means. I have a little bit of Bitcoin. I have a lot of other things, but you said it has no. The proof of work is valueless or has no value, doesn't bring value. And I'm thinking about how we can improve energy, and usage, so what would you say to a Bitcoin maximalist of what you just said to me?
Yeah, so I'll actually kind of conflict against myself here and go against myself. I think a bunch of different proof of work chains makes no sense. I think the reason why proof of work for Bitcoin actually makes sense from a societal standpoint, and the reason why I think all of the energy fudders who say that it's kind of bad for the environment don't realize how Bitcoin is, one, creating a massive incentive for decreasing the cost of electricity, which is beneficial for society. More electricity usage and lower cost is like one of the biggest indicators for improving quality of life globally, or basically moving people out of poverty globally. So when you look at GDP of these countries, it's usually tied to a lot of these kind of factors. So I think that innovation is in itself is a good reason to have Bitcoin around, because you make money by having cheap electricity. And then the second thing is that there's actually a lot of wastage of electricity that exists with a lot of these plants and plants and renewable energy. And it actually kind of, there's an argument that it would actually enable using some of this, what typically would be wasted energy, and just use that for mining Bitcoin. So the net effect on the climate is kind of like actually zero. But when you're looking at, if there are 1,000 proof of work chains, well, the other 999 don't exist. Bitcoin itself is providing the incentives to reduce the cost of electricity. The other 999 are just wasting energy, and that's in my mind, that's why that's useless proof of work. So hopefully that makes sense.
Makes sense. Great. So you mentioned earlier, about applications that are heavy data reliant. Like, how best can data reliant applications thrive by being on chain? And what's some of the application examples?
Yeah, so there are kind of many kind of examples of it. I think one of the interesting angles is, one, again, the cost component. The cost of running these things on chain should tend to zero much quicker than in the real world. So if you're using just traditional web services, that's kind of the end goal, which is that how can the cost of you building a web service tend to zero? How can the cost of implementation also tend to zero as well? Those are two very important things. So I think that's one way that these kind of applications will thrive at scale. I also think we're very focused on also serving the crypto economy. of applications, which are ones that have tokens and needs to define monetary policy based off of that, and also wanted to do a lot more things on chain. So, for example, if you want to give out tokens based on people uploading useful data, whether you're trying to aggregate specific kind of subsets of data, specific data sets, and you essentially dish out tokens based on the data that's uploaded. Those are kind of specific on-chain use cases where we're really focused. So where kind of data meets liquidity is definitely really interesting. And I think another thing to consider is that right now we're obviously very early in our lifetime as an L1, but in 5 years down the road, or 5 years down the road, there'll be kind of lots more applications, hundreds, thousands of applications on Irys. And the amount of data that will exist will be massive, and the amount of services that exist. And where the network effects really come in, and where the benefit comes for people to deploy at that point, is now you have this massive crypto economy of services which you can tap into, and also a crypto economy worth of data as well. So that there's this kind of component of composability between all of these services and all of these data sets that exist on Irys.
I'm trying to think about who the big data storage companies are in Web 2. I think, Google, I think Amazon, there's maybe Alibaba, some others. How do you compete or, someday with these guys and make it a better world for people to access their data?
Yeah, so if you look at it from a pure storage standpoint, where the competition comes in, and it'll take some time to get there, is that, again, it ties into the same concept where if cost is tending to zero I guess I'll say a few things. One is the cost of hardware for things like storage is tending to zero. But you'll notice that the cost of using things like S3 and AWS, etc., is not tending to zero. So there's kind of this disconnect between reality and the actual pricing. And the idea is that all crypto networks, but data chains specifically, are about removing middlemen and removing this like massive arbitrage that exists within the kind of traditional world. So the idea is that storage will be way, way cheaper with something like a data chain, something like Irys. But now the second thing to compete on is, okay, how do you improve performance and make the usage of these services identical to what exists today? And that's actually where the tougher problem lies. And that's actually what Irys was very focused on for the last 2 years. So my view is that in order for that to happen, one is the cost is already super low. So that's not the issue. It's about building these other kind of peripheral kind of products and services around it to make it more kind of easy to use. And some of those services include CDNs, just like basic S3 wrappers around these networks, and some other kind of mutability primitives. So that there are a bunch of different primitives that need to be built in order to get to that endpoint, which is some of the stuff that we want to incubate. But we're actually not that far away from having something that competes like we as a space have something competing with the likes of AWS and Google.
I'd love to see it, hopefully sooner than later, right? So
I hope so.
Yeah. So you say that you are deep in the trenches, right? What does it mean to be deep in the trenches, and why is it important to have your community in the trenches with you?
Yeah, deep in the trenches is a nice kind of play on words that our team came up with, but it's an initiative to kind of shed more light on the deep in space. My view on deep in is that it is one of the biggest revenue drivers outside of DeFi, but also one of the most underhyped. Seemingly, the world finds it very boring side of the space for whatever reason, and that just makes no sense to me. So I'm a very kind of big advocate for deep in. I think it is one of the only categories outside of DeFi that have massive product market fit. To be honest, when you look at Helium, etc., these guys are actually getting exponential adoption at this point, exponential growth adoption. So yeah, one of it is it's kind of a community initiative to shed more light on a lot of these DeepIn networks, and we have a bunch of the DeepIn networks actually in that community. It's a Twitter X community, and we'll be kind of going a little bit deeper on that over time. But I think to speak a little bit more broadly about community more generally, it is one of the most important things in Web3. You do need a great product, a great network, whatever, and you do need to have very good kind of business team, et cetera, et cetera. But if you don't have a good community, then the sad reality within crypto is that you're always going to be you're going to be quite a few steps behind. So the goal is, how can we actually support a lot of these how can we build a strong community, especially around categories that we think are actually important to the space. And DeepIn is one of those.
So I always thought, I forgot who told me this a few years ago. They said things that work don't need to be hyped; they just work, And I think of DeepIn in that way, and I think the opposite of that is meme coins that don't work, but they're good for hype, And the community seems to be really robust around meme coins. How do you attract, smart investors, smart users, people who understand the tech into using DeepIn and growing that from there?
Yeah, so I think DeepIn actually has a bunch of hype from a bunch of investment now from VCs, definitely more in the last 12 months. There are a bunch of DeepIn specific funds as well. There's one on our cap table actually called EV3, who we have good kind of relationships with as well. And actually, I can name a bunch of funds now that are very heavy in DeepIn. I think Multicoin was one of the early seeds, and yes, Solana, but also Helium and some of these other kind of big networks. So I think the investor side is less of an issue. I think on the retail side, it's kind of hard to point out why there's no hype. I suspect it's because it might be like a founder. Actually, I don't want to call people out. It might be like a founder archetype thing, where maybe they're very good at the demand side, but perhaps don't understand the token Web3 game. I don't know if that's actually true, because Helium raised a bunch of money, and the token did fairly well in previous markets. But I think when I meet a lot of people who are in the DeepIn space right now, they are absolutely like geniuses on building the network and actually bootstrapping demand, which is, by the way, the two hardest things. And then the third perhaps is kind of attracting retail, is broadly a macro thing and broadly a marketing problem. And it's just a very different skill set. So maybe that's why there's less hype, but we're super bullish DeepIn simply because the fundamentals are so strong. It's literally impossible to ignore. If a protocol goes from $0 to $1 million of revenue within a year or two, that's literally better than 99.999% of any protocols that existed, in the last decade, right? So yeah, that's kind of how I look at DeepIn.
Got it. It makes sense to me. Thank you. So, couple last questions. One is, what do we have forward to what do we look forward to the most with Irys in an upcoming 6 months, a year? What can people get excited about?
Yeah, so we have 3 big milestones, I think. One is we have private test. We have a version 1 of the private testnet out, but we have a more kind of open version of private testnet coming out soon, where you'll be able to do a bunch of executional related things, start to build DeFi on Irys and things like that, which is going to be perhaps not a big public milestone, but it's very important for us. It's very important to start to build this kind of wider ecosystem, because we want to launch with this very prosperous ecosystem by the time we go to mainnet. And then thereafter, we're looking to do public testnet and mainnet within the next 6 to 12 months. I at least hope. I see no reason that, but so those are probably those are the big milestones. But we've got also a bunch of other interesting things down the pipeline, which you should look on, follow us on X to keep updated.
Awesome. And that's my next question. Really, is my last. I want to thank you very much for speaking with me today. I enjoy talking to you, and I love learning what you're up to at Irys. This is great. So my last question is, how can people find out more information about you, about Irys, in Twitter, X, obviously? How else can they do that? How can they start using L1? How can they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're just interested in keeping updated, and I think Twitter is a really good place, a combination of the Irys_XYZ account and then mine. My account has a lot more of the kind of technical, lower level stuff. If you're interested in that. We obviously have our docs as well if you want to learn a little bit more about the technicals, or if you want to start building with Irys as well. I'd also say just DM me. I'm terminally online. It's kind of bad for my mental health, great for Irys. Yeah, so I'm always happy to chat. And I guess if you're kind of not in those categories, and you actually, or if you want to get much deeper into the community related activities, we have a bunch of really fun stuff going on in our Discord. So that's definitely a place to dwell if you're looking for some fun activities.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time today.
Likewise, I appreciate it, sir.